we seek to gather insights into a host of issues, especially concerning religion. Though hugely helpful, religion becomes a prison if it is not transcended. Beyond religion, we meet as human beings, free to love and cherish each other. Here, we celebrate our freedom to be richly and rationally human.
Good morning, welcome once again to our channel, Beyond Religion. We sincerely hope that you've been finding our discussions helpful to think in a profound, deeper sense about what it means to be alive in this world and what spirituality has to do with our day-to-day walk. Dear sir, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you.
It's great to be together.
Thank you. So, in our yesterday's session, towards the end, we talked about how God is in the process of molding us and shaping us, and we refer to where it says in the Bible that He's refining us, as a refiner purifies gold, and so to bring out the gold in us, He has to get rid of the impurities.
Yes.
And that need not be a very smooth process. It could be a little painful, but we endure some struggles, and in the process we are purified and refined.
Yes.
One of our viewers had an interesting question about that.
Yeah.
He asked, where does free will come into play when it comes to this refining process?
Yes.
Are we as people gifted with free will, and then if the refinement process is still ongoing, how does free will have a part in that?
That's right. Oh, I'm glad that there is this very perceptive response from an audience, from a member of the audience. And this is precisely what we value, that there are questions, searching questions. And it's a beautiful thing in a human being to seek answers for oneself.
Yes.
The alternative to seeking answers is simply swallowing whatever others are saying in a passive manner, which actually reflects poorly on the intellectual caliber and the state of aliveness of a human being. So from Jesus' point of view, asking and seeking are fundamental human responsibilities. He said, ask, seek, knock. So let us now look at this. Now I'll just define that question in a very simple and sharp manner so that we can fix it in our minds. The question is, if God is shaping us, say through the medium of suffering, what happens to our free will? Does God interfere with or abrogate, that is, destroy our freedom of will, freedom of choice, freedom to do whatever we like to do, by way of shaping us for a purpose, God's purpose. After all, these are God's purposes.
That's right.
And they may not be my purpose. This is the question. And I think it's a very important and interesting question. Now, what I have to say to begin with is that freedom must be understood not in the abstract. Freedom must always be understood, and it makes sense only if we understand freedom in relation to the particular phenomenon, particular person, particular species, particular situation. For example, my freedom in relation to water is swimming, not walking on it. God may walk on it, but that's not my freedom. So if I try to walk on water and I sink, I can't say, why are you not respecting my freedom? Right? So my freedom is that I can learn to swim. But that freedom also comes after a lot of struggle. I have to learn to swim.
Right.
I have to jump into the water, I have to thrash about, and I have to learn the grammar of swimming. That is when my freedom becomes real. Otherwise, my freedom is only the freedom to sink.
Right.
That's my freedom.
That's right.
Right. So we have to understand things right. For example, the freedom of a coconut tree is the freedom to produce coconuts. right?
That's right.
And the freedom of a mango tree is to produce mango fruits. The freedom of a mango tree is not to produce coconuts. So, if this is understood, that freedom is never abstract and absolute, and that in order for freedom to be real and meaningful, freedom has to be contextualized. That is, put in a context. As I said, the freedom of a mango tree is to produce mango fruits. That's a contextualization of freedom. So, or I may use a bad English and say, it is the mangoization of freedom in relation to the mango tree, right? Now, suppose a mango tree is not producing fruits. Its purpose is to produce fruits. Then the farmer concerned may do something which, in his opinion, might help the mango tree overcome that limitation.
Right.
Maybe it will lop off a branch, or it may even cut a tree nearby, or whatever it is. So these are all simple illustrations in nature. They have got their limitations. A human being is 1,000,000 times more complex than a mango tree or a coconut tree or water or anything. So when it comes to us, the uniqueness of being human can only be understood in light of the fact that we are God's creation. And in fact, this may take a little effort to understand, but let me explain this. From ancient of days, one stream of thought maintained that God is continually expressing himself through various facets of ongoing creation. That God did not just conclude creation in 6 days, that he continues to express himself. Creation is God's self-expression. There's no doubt about it. Because when you say that God created the world, heaven and earth, it means that heaven and earth are God's expression of himself. Right? For example, if an artist does a piece of painting, it is his self-expression. If a poet writes a poem, it is his self-expression. It is not the expression of some abstract person. It's not. This poem is not written by artificial intelligence, right? So, all creativity is a form of self-expression. Now, the point is that God's self, God's being, is infinite, inexhaustible, and God's need to express himself did not end in 6 days, some 5,000 years ago or 5 million years ago. God's need for self-expression continues. Why? Because God is love. Love is a living and dynamic force, and its need to continue to express never ends.
Right.
I can't say, I loved you 2,000 years ago.
Right.
No, I have to say I love you today.
Right.
I love you tomorrow. My love for you will never end, or will not end as long as I am alive. So if God is love, one thing is absolutely logically clear. The process of creation and God's self-expression through creation will never end. Right? So we have to understand that when we are created by God, number one, and we are created within a larger context. Now, that is true even about nature. No mango tree exists by itself. A single mango tree all over the world.
Nothing in nature can exist in
everything.
isolation.
Everything is in a state of interdependence.
Yes.
Okay. Now, when interdependence comes, there has to be a modification of freedom. There's an old saying that my freedom ends where your nose
begins. I think Churchill said that.
That's right.
Yeah.
My freedom ends where your nose begins. And that is because just as you have a nose, I also have a nose.
Yes.
If I don't respect your nose, you will not respect my nose,
Yes.
and both of us will not have noses left, right? So, the idea that our freedom should remain untouched by anyone is completely unrealistic. In fact, freedom is real only because there are other people. If you are living alone on an island, your freedom makes no sense. Freedom from what? Right. So that brings me to the next point of my argument. Freedom has got two aspects. One is freedom from. The other is freedom for. Most people, and especially when they are young, and I know this because I was young, and this is how I thought about freedom. Most people think of freedom as freedom from. That is, I'm free from this, I'm free from that, I'm free from God, I'm free from responsibilities at home, I'm free from limitations, I can roam around and do what I want. Now that's freedom from. The most important part of freedom is, the creative part of freedom is freedom for. What are you free for? If God gives you, say, a much more freedom than you have today, what will you do with it? For that matter, the question is, what are you doing with your freedom even today? The freedom that you have, what are you doing with it? Let me give you an illustration. About 40 years ago, I started learning to play tennis. I still remember the first day I walked into the tennis court with a wooden racket in hand in my tennis kit. And each ball I hit went far above the baseline. So, my freedom to play tennis was very, very limited. Right. But as I persevered with it and practiced and perfected my court craft, my freedom to play tennis increased and increased and increased. And, it became a beautiful thing. So, I can say my freedom to play tennis depends on not having baseline, service line, sidelines, and the net. That freedom abolishes tennis as a game. I can never play tennis, right? So my freedom to play tennis demands that there be these lines of restriction, including the net. Right? So likewise, any human activity which has a purpose must have limitations. Now, for example, if you want to drink a glass of water, that water has to be held in a glass. You can't say, well, why should I be bothered with the glass? I only want water. I can't drink glass. No. But that's not sensible. It makes no sense. So, if you believe that God is your creator, that's a fundamental thing. And then secondly, if you believe that God is continually expressing himself through his creation, including you, that is the idea of having a purpose to one's existence. Now, there are two different levels of purposes. One is, by virtue of being individuals, we have our own purposes. But that's also an illusion, because what we consider to be our purposes may not be our purposes at all. These are purposes we have copied from others. For example, it's your purpose when you study to get a big job. Job which gives you a 6-figure salary. How is that your purpose? It's a purpose that you borrowed from everybody around. Suppose you grew up in an ascetic community. That may not have been your purpose at all.
That's right.
Your purpose would have been to lead a very simple life, where 5 or 6-figure salaries irrelevant. So very often we are deluded in thinking that these are my purposes. See? The other purpose is the purpose that is written into my creation. By virtue of being born in a particular context, in a particular period, in a particular society, as a human being, there is a purpose. And that purpose is a beautiful thing, it's a great thing. By the way, the value of everything depends on its purpose. For example, the value of a kitchen knife is not the same as the value of a pen, right? With a kitchen knife, you cannot write a novel.
That's right.
With a pen, you can write a novel. Now, at the same time, if this pen is in the hands of a Nobel laureate, then this pen will have a different value, right?
That's right.
You go to Sabarmati Ashram, you will find Gandhiji's clocks, wooden footwear, and an old toothbrush preserved as national treasure, right? Now, if I don't think anyone will preserve my toothbrush. I've discarded so many of my toothbrushes because they have no value, right? So, it is purpose that determines value, right? If I understand my freedom in a manner that rejects the purpose of my existence, then I'm destroying my freedom. Because end of the day, freedom is the freedom to fulfill the purpose of one's very existence. is most important to say. Now, I remember reading a book by Bertrand Russell. It's titled Political Ideals. And there he says, among many other things that he says that one important aspect of freedom in modern life is the freedom to express oneself through the work one does. So, likewise, the freedom in our life as human beings depends very much on whether or not we are following or trying to fulfill the purpose of our existence. But sad to say, many people remain indifferent to this question. What is the purpose of my life? Now, what I want to ask is this. How do I decide what I should do, where I should be, or how I should live this day, if I don't have a sense of purpose?
Right.
Or for that matter, my sense of purpose is quite different from the sense of purpose that I entertain today is quite different from my real sense of purpose which is written into my creation. God may have a wonderful purpose for me, but I forget all that. Like the lost son in the parable Jesus taught, the parable of the prodigal son.
Right.
Jesus doesn't use the word prodigal. He thought the purpose of his life was to enjoy himself, indulgence. But he realizes that was not the purpose.
That's right.
He goes and destroys himself. But then sense dawns on him and he comes back. That return journey is also freedom. Tremendous freedom. And in comparison to the freedom to walk out on one's home, the real meaning of freedom is expressed by the return journey. Home is a place, home is a context where the purpose of one's life is clear and is being followed. Home as a metaphor, right? Homelessness is a state of life in which one is alienated from the true purpose of one's life. Now, homelessness is an important modern metaphor, right? Now, that homelessness is not a matter of the material brick and mortar structure. You are homeless with respect to yourself. You are ill at ease with yourself, which is the worst form of human life, or worst condition of life in relation to freedom. Now, one very, very simple way of understanding whether you are living in true freedom or false freedom is, ask yourself, am I ill at ease with myself? If I'm ill at ease with myself, then I'm abusing my freedom and I am not following the true purpose of my life, right? Now, therefore, true freedom comes, and I'm now going to state something very important. True freedom comes when there is a harmony of my will with the will of God. Right? Now I'm going to say something slightly provocative. God's will is developed and fixed. Because, I tell you why. Because God's will comprehends the sum total of creation. I mean, we take one aspect of creation, 7.5 billion people, right? Now, if God's will is continually shifting, there will be utter chaos. There has to be a fixed format, fixed framework within which things happen. And that fixed framework is the will of God.
That's
right. So, God's will cannot change in an arbitrary and random manner because I like it that way. So my likes and dislikes, my whims and fancies cannot modify the will of God. And this is what I want people, especially Christians, to understand when they pray and try to influence the will of God and twist it this way and that way. I mean, it cannot happen. It should not happen. Because if God's will is arbitrary, then the whole world becomes impossible. There will be utter chaos here. So God's will cannot be twisted around my little finger. Then if harmony between the two wills is to be achieved, there's only one way. And that is, I must adjust myself to the will of God. Why? Because the origin of my will itself is in the will of God.
That's right.
So if my will is to originate, God's will has to be proper and objective, not subjective and fluid and flexible and unpredictable and random, right? So I have to discern the will of God That's why seek the will of God. We say, I have to discern or seek and understand the will of God and adjust myself to that will, because as the Italian poet Dante says, in his will is my peace. In his will is my peace. I would even say, in his will is my freedom. Now, God's will is that we become effective in our life. Right?
Right.
Now, I remember reading a book on psychology which talked about the 4 wishes of Thomson. Thomson was an American psychologist. He evolved this theory of the 4 fundamental wishes of all human beings. And one of the 4 fundamental wishes of human beings is the desire to be effective. Or therefore, one of the universal points of human frustration is the reality of ineffectiveness, which also becomes fruitlessness or barren life. Now, the ineffectiveness of life issues largely from the inability to fulfill the purpose with which we are born or we are created. Now, one indication as to the purpose of your creation is a special gift that you are given and the special flavor of your personality, which is what we mean by uniqueness. Now, God creates every one of us as unique. Why? Unique. This is not a matter of cosmetics. This is not a matter of luxury. It's a matter of bare necessity. Because what you can do, nobody else can do in this world. You cannot be substituted by anyone in this world. And that is the measure of human uniqueness. Now you look at nature, if one tree falls, you can plant a similar tree there. Suppose you have a cow and that cow dies, you can buy another cow and tie that cow there. But if one human being dies, nobody else can take his or her place. That's the greatness of being human. Therefore, if that is understood, and that's so very obvious, then you cannot but accept the fact that God has created all of us, and God creates all human beings with a unique purpose and a unique personality. And that is the indication that there is a very special and unique purpose waiting to be fulfilled. And freedom is given to us as the condition that facilitates the fulfillment of that purpose. Freedom is not given to us as mere luxury, that it may be used as license to do whatever we want. And in this reality of addiction, we have a warning as to what happens when freedom is misused and abused. And I want to conclude on this. One universal principle is this: if you abuse your freedom, you will lose it. If you abuse your freedom, you'll end up in slavery. Now, abusing freedom has various forms. It is not merely, the violent forms of abuse like, drug addiction and alcohol addiction, or going and hitting somebody or practicing violence. That is certainly very reprehensible. But that's not the only form of abusing freedom. There are subtle forms of abusing freedom. For example, laziness is a form of abusing freedom, because you have the freedom to work or not work. Right?
That's right.
The freedom to develop or not to develop is given to you. So if you don't develop your talents, that is an abuse of your freedom. That's what I learned from the parable of the talents. See, the master gives 5 talents, 4 talents, 1 talent to 3 different servants. The first 2 servants go and apply and multiply those talents. The third servant goes and digs a pit and buries it. Right? Now, the point is, the first 2 servants were free. The third servant was not free. He abused his freedom. And therefore, what happens? He's cast out into the outer darkness where there is no freedom. Complete loss of freedom is the theme of that very profound parable. And there Jesus teaches that your freedom is something that you have to affirm and expand for yourself. And how do you do that? by entering fully into all God-given resources and possibilities, and continually addressing the God-given purpose in your life in order to fulfill it to the maximum possible extent, which accounts for the mystery of the glory of life. That's when you feel fulfilled. You know, one of the things that Jesus said from the cross, it is fulfilled.
It is
Oh, that's amazing. That is the ultimate expression of human freedom. And the paradox here is that Jesus is fixed on the cross. He is hanging on 3 nails, right? Driven through raw flesh.
Yeah.
But in that state, he expresses the zenith of freedom. He says, it's fulfilled. That's the kind of freedom we should have. So now to conclude, therefore, when God shapes us for a purpose through the furnace of suffering, it doesn't interfere with our freedom. Rather, it enlarges our freedom, makes our freedom more creative, fruitful, and life-enhancing, not only for ourselves, but also for a large number of others. Freedom is given to us that we may glorify God with it. Freedom is given to us that we may truly and freely turn to God, not that we may freely turn away from God, which is an abuse of freedom, and that abuse of freedom will abrogate your freedom.
Right. So, when you are talking to me, I'm reminded of, in context of free will and God's will and God's purpose and our purpose, the Bible very beautifully describes the story of Joseph.
Yes.
Joseph was somebody who was persecuted and slaved into slavery.
Yes.
In the process, he lost his freedom. And
Yes.
he's taken as a prisoner to Egypt. And yet, God's purpose prevailed, even when it seemed that he was losing his freedom and it seemed that he was undergoing all kinds of suffering. It was still but a training ground for the much greater purpose he had in life.
Yes.
So,
yes, I think you have used a very important illustration, but a very paradoxical one. And I'm going to comment on that. You see, the story of Joseph actually begins in unfreedom. He's caught by his own brothers, then is put in a dry well, and from there, the next bit of insult, he is then sold to strangers. And then he reaches the house of Potiphar and the rest of the story in Egypt. Now, I want to introduce a very, very paradoxical concept now. This is from the philosophy of history. It's not very difficult. But, you see, this idea was originated by Hegel, the German philosopher, who talks about, in his philosophy of history, talks about the cunning of reason. I'll explain what that means. Hegel says, look, we find something very strange in history, and that is, yes, individuals are free to act, and individuals and groups, they go on doing whatever they want. This world is full of agendas, right? But then he says, something else is happening above them, right? End of the day, it is not whatever is happening down below at the level of individuals and groups in terms of human agendas that prevails. It is something higher. And not only that, even though the agents of action upon this earth are not conscious of having any connection with this higher level of action, they are constantly fulfilling this also without knowing it. That's why he uses the word cunning. So, in fact, Hegel's idea is that history is God making himself. No, it's a problematic idea, but there's an intuition in it which I accept. In other words, there's a connection between God and history. That's my word. God may not be making himself through history. I would say God is expressing himself through history. And therefore, ultimately, it is the will of God that prevails. A similar idea I found in the greatest of British historians, called Arnold Toynbee. He says that there is a spirit that governs all activities upon this earth. and he says that's the evil spirit. But he says there is a higher spirit which intervenes, and he says that's the Holy Spirit. He is not a believer. He's not a Christian even. He's an agnostic. But he says that when you look at history, you cannot but look at these two different forces continually acting. So therefore, now coming to this story, when you look at what is happening on the ground, people are doing some wicked things. But all that is part of God's intention that Joseph should reach Egypt. Right? And that has got its own logic. I will not deal with it now. So then he reaches the house of Potiphar. Potiphar is the military officer, and his wife takes an interest in him. There again, Joseph is now facing another form of unfreedom, and that is slavery to sensual life, and slavery to a life of deception. Now, it was would have been a terrible temptation for Joseph, the young man, when the wife of the officer, a very influential, affluent, powerful man in Egypt, takes an interest in him, to collapse, right? But he has the sense of divine purpose. You see, what enables us to stand our ground and not collapse into compromises is this clear sense of purpose. If you don't have that sense of purpose, you will certainly collapse. Make no doubt about it. You will collapse. So there is that point of reference in the mind or in the conscience of Joseph that there is a between his own actions and something larger than himself. Right? Otherwise he would have collapsed. Anyway, this goes on and on. Then he interprets dreams and he gains the confidence of Pharaoh. Ultimately, he becomes number 2 in the political structure. Now, I want to say something which most people don't talk about. I think there was a terrible collapse, terrible failure in the life of Joseph. And that is where I believe that Joseph deviated from the plan of God. And nobody talks about it. What does he do?
I'm very curious.
What does he do? He actually enters into collusion with Pharaoh when the famine comes to rob the people of Egypt of their land, their money, their labor, and the whole country is reduced into slavery. I don't think that was God's plan at all. No? There, what happened is he got mixed up with the administrative structure. His proximity to Pharaoh reduced his sense of accountability to God, and he gets sucked into the political the grammar of realpolitik. How politics is done. Politics is brutal. Politics has no margin for truth and justice. It is brute force. So take advantage of the helplessness of the people, right? Now, I cannot agree at all with this. And I would say that the seed of the slavery of the people of God, the Jews, started with this compromise on the part of Joseph. That's why the Jews end up in slavery, and they languish in slavery in Egypt for 480 years. And then, of course, they cried to God, and God raises a leader called Moses, and then the rest of the story you know. So I think it's very important for us to realize that you may have followed the purposes of God for, say, for 30 years of your life, and God may have raised you very high. But at that point in time, do you still remember God? Or do you follow some other authority and some other agenda and do what is ungodly? Which might influence your power or your profit. But what happens? Generations will suffer in the process. Okay? So that is something that nobody talks about. So it's very important. And I believe that Joseph departed from God's plan for him at that point in time. At that point in time when he became so close to Pharaoh that he was far away from God.
Yeah, it's interesting. Coming back to it's interesting that thought. But again, there is an underlying purpose that goes beyond Joseph. In fact, I think it was to Joseph's great-grandfather that God says, your people will go into bondage for 400 years. And as you consider the timeline of how things occurred, it happened precisely thus. But again, in the context of our free will, just to
Mm.
conclude this segment,
Yeah.
I think it's beautiful in during the time of reunion that Joseph had with his brothers. He says this. He says that what you intended for evil, God
Yes.
intended for good,
Yes,
and
yes.
so it was very interesting the thought about what you mentioned. The German philosopher Hegel said
Yes.
about the
Cunning of reason.
cunning of reason. And even the British historian that talked about
Yeah.
the two powers in play.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, sir, for that response. Yeah.